Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, this is a panel about accountability. Before I introduce it fully, could I give the floor to Ladislav Hamran, who is the president of Eurojust. Unfortunately, because we're running a bit late, Ladislav has to leave. Just as an introduction, he's a public prosecutor with over 20 years of experience, particularly in cases involving economic crime, corruption, and asset recovery. He, after completing his legal studies at the Faculty of Law of Comenius University in Bratislav, started working as a prosecutor in 1997, and in 2020 he was re-elected as president of Eurojust, the European Agency for Criminal Justice and Cooperation. Ladislav, welcome. What is it that Eurojust can do to help with accountability in Ukraine and in Bucha? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, sir. Dear Chair, dear Excellencies, and dear colleagues. We just heard three testimonies of survivors full of violence, brutalities, and suffering. And I would like to express my deepest sympathies to the victims and survivors of the attacks in Bucha. I say this not only as the president of Eurojust, but as a son, as a brother, and as a father. While there are no words that can possibly compensate for your loss, I want you to know that the full force of the international legal community is behind you. And as prosecutors, we see it not only as our obligation, but also as our privilege to contribute to bringing you the justice that you deserve. In close cooperation with the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office, Eurojust experts are working around the clock to build the strongest possible case against those responsible for what happened in Bucha. We have to set up a joint investigation team between Ukraine and 6 EU member states, and it's now the biggest investigation we have ever supported. On a daily basis, we provide legal, analytical, financial, and logistical assistance ranging from the translation of important evidence to encrypted phones and laptops. Legally proving the different elements that jointly constitute the crime of genocide is challenging, and it requires a structured and systematic approach. This all starts with solid and admissible evidence. And this is precisely where a recent initiative of Eurojust can be a real game changer, we believe. When it comes to the attacks on Bucha and to the war in Ukraine in general, we see that the evidence is located in many different jurisdictions and collected by a wide range of stakeholders. To address this scattered evidentiary landscape, Eurojust has recently launched the Core International Crime Evidence Database. We will use the database to centrally store and analyze evidence, including photographs, satellite images, videos, and audio recordings. Bringing together the evidence currently in possession of many different countries and stakeholders has important benefits. It allows us to shed light on not only on individual offenses, but also on the systemic actions behind them, which is really essential when investigating and prosecuting the crimes of genocide. Maintaining an overview of interviewed victims also helps to avoid re-victimization by repeated interviews. And finally, the possibility to secure storage outside the location of the armed conflict can prevent the loss of evidence. This database will serve the joint investigation team, criminal cases before national jurisdictions, and possibly prosecutions and possible prosecutions by the International Criminal Court. I hope that those who suffered from the attacks in Bucha will find some consolation in knowing that never in history of armed conflicts has there been a greater determination to getting justice done. Across countries, continents and organizations, we are doing everything we can make sure that perpetrators will face their day in court. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, President. Could I ask for the remaining panelists to take the floor? Whilst they're taking the floor, could I just ask a question, President? Who can send information to the database?
We expect evidence from our partners who have a cooperation agreement with Eurojust or are permanent members of Eurojust. Currently, we are speaking about 36 countries.
Thank you.
Judicial authorities of those countries.
Thank you. As I said at the beginning, this is a panel about accountability. And as you'll see very shortly, we have some of the leading voices and leading professionals engaged in this difficult endeavor. Before February 2022, it was almost unthinkable that Bucha would become emblematic of Russia's policy of crimes. A symbol of Russia's cruelty that has now resonated across the world. Now this quiet and prosperous town must take its unenviable place alongside Rwanda, Srebrenica, Sinjar, Darfur, and too many other places marked by the cruelty of man. On the 27th of February 2022, Russia's convoy of military vehicles entered the streets of Bucha, as they did in many other towns in the Kiev suburbs and in Ukraine as a whole. Budianka, Makariv, Irpin, Hostomel, Daima, and so on. Drunk with delusions of power and grandeur, the Russian forces advanced towards Kiev. Apparently, according to the evidence, Russian forces believed, as Putin believed, that they would somehow be welcomed as liberators. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth, but it did set the stage for the atrocities that were to follow. As the Russian advance in Kiev came to a halt, Russian troops in Bucha and the Kiev suburbs engaged in so-called cleansing operations that targeted civilians for detention, arbitrary violence, and death. These were not accidents, military excess, or Russian troops on frolics of their own. There was a method to these crimes. Systematized violence, intending to target civilians. According to the Royal United Services Institute and the prosecution's investigations, Russian troops had been ordered to block and destroy so-called nationalist resistance, using lists compiled by Russian intelligence. They conducted Zazistka cleansing operations, sweeping neighborhoods to identify and neutralize anyone who might pose a so-called threat. The summary executions of 9 innocent men at the Russian headquarters at Yablonska Street are now etched into our collective grief. But these were 9 of many of thousands of crimes. The Ukrainian police recovered nearly 40 bodies along that street alone. The Ukrainian police and the prosecution have documented at least 700 deaths in the Bucha region, hundreds more detained, tortured, sexually violated, or injured. So as the prosecution investigations, which you're going to hear about shortly, show, as I said, there was a method to these crimes. And that's what we're going to talk about now. What happens next? What are the prospects for accountability? How can justice be obtained? Is it possible? Is it national? Is it regional? Is it international? Are we talking about war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, aggression? Does the legal categorization matter? And as I've said, we really have a sterling panel who can cast a light on some of these important issues. So first of all, let me turn to the Prosecutor General, who has perhaps the greatest burden when it comes to trying to bring accountability for these terrible crimes. Prosecutor General since July of 2022 and conducts, as we all know, investigations and supervises them and the prosecutions across Ukraine. So Prosecutor General, Bucha was one of the first towns occupied by Russia. As we know and as we've heard today, atrocious crimes. Where are we with the national investigations?
Thank you, Wayne. And you mentioned that I'm carrying one of the hardest burdens to serve justice. But you know, after 7, 8 already, maybe even 9 months of my being Prosecutor General, I would like to say that it looks that it's hardest burden for me personally. But the truth is that I'm not alone carrying this burden. You're with me. Payam with me. Wade with us. All our partners with us. Ladislav Hamran is with us. Nida Grunskine and all of Prosecutors General of our friends and allies are with us. Kalinda is today with us. All friends and allies are carrying this burden with me and with my prosecutors and investigators. And this really raises not only hope, but I would say belief that justice would be served, that justice would be served for Ukrainians and for Ukraine. I would like to also to welcome the Secretary General of Europol. Europol is with us, and justice would be served for Ukrainians, for Ukraine, and for all of the values of freedom and justice for which our soldiers are fighting on the front line. And that justice would be served in all layers here in Ukraine, where we will prosecute and we will send to courts, as I say, 99+% of all criminal investigations with regard to war crimes committed by Russians. And justice would be served in a second layer by the International Criminal Court, where we reached an unprecedented support and created unprecedented before partnership with the prosecutors of this independent international judiciary institution. Unprecedented, why? Because always in its history, the prosecutors of the ICC tried to overcome the resistance from national authorities in order to deliver justice where national institutions are unwilling or unable to do it by themselves. We are willing and able, and we are grateful for the ICC, who starts with the case which shows explicitly complementary role where Putin become one of the suspects who, by the international law, who has personal immunity from criminal investigation, not only in Ukraine, but in any other country, as the president. And this first case is also a matter of respect from the prosecutors of the ICC with regard to our investigators and prosecutors of all law enforcement agencies who started their work after Bucha was liberated from the very first day. Not only the State Security Service investigators who should investigate these articles, these crimes by our criminal procedural code, but also National Police, State Bureau of Investigations, even detectives of National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine were collecting evidences of war crimes committed in Bucha and surroundings of Kiev. Practically all the country, those who could work, were gathered at several days here to collect evidences. And we will go ahead with the International Criminal Court with regard to all crimes all international crimes that could be, and I believe should be, investigated by Prosecutor Khan team, not only war crimes, but crimes against humanity and crime of genocide. And third layer of our quest for criminal justice is what Ladislav mentioned just a few minutes ago, are national investigations opened by 20 jurisdictions, for which this Core International Crimes Evidence Database is prepared, because they collect evidences about war crimes committed in Ukraine, mostly from Ukrainians who are now safely located and warmly welcomed in not only European but also American states. And these evidences are usually about different incidents of war crimes. And in order not to lose any piece of evidence and not to lose any potential criminal case, this exchange evidence database would serve to all 20 countries, to joint investigation team, to the ICC, in order to know who has which evidence, not to lose, to exchange, to help, to complete investigations where we can do it. And of course, fourth layer of our criminal quest for justice is the prosecution and punishment for those who started this war of aggression. And this should be organized internationally. And we need as much and as wide international support to create the special tribunal for the crime of aggression, so that not only to fill in the existing gap in international law, but also to deter any future aggressor who could try to start aggression in any other part of the world. And we also need now to combine our efforts to repair the system of international law to ensure long-lasting peace in Ukraine, in Europe and worldwide. Because all perpetrators of the international law, they definitely know when the international mechanism is absent. They definitely knew that being a permanent member of the Security Council, they will use this right of permanent member to block the possibility which is provided by the UN Charter. And we all need to know for the future that this could happen, and we need all together to create new system of law and order to ensure this long-lasting peace, not only for us, but for our children, grandchildren, and their children. You know that Bucha is not only the place of mass atrocities, it's literally the place where all possible war crimes were committed. And this is not a big territory, but it showed that the attitude of Russians who occupied Bucha was absolutely intentional: to kill, to break morale, to break resistance, just because people who peacefully lived in Bucha were Ukrainians. In some of our cases, we started to investigate not only those who committed these crimes here, but also those who tried to incite them to do, and tried to explain why they seem this could be done. The quotes, I will quote now them. There is no Ukraine. There is Ukraineness. That is a specific disorder of the mind. End of the quote. These were the words spoken within days of invasion by Vladislav Surkov, Kremlin ideologue and former advisor to Russian president. The rhetoric of accusing Ukrainians of Nazism became an additional pretext for intervention for Russia. With the establishment of the territorial control over captured settlements, violent crimes against civilian population intensified, along with the search for the so-called pro-Ukrainian or anti-Russia residents, targeting those perceived to be leaders. You heard now, they asked, where are Nazis? This was asked hundreds and thousands of times in different places in Ukraine, which were occupied. Violence was aimed at removing resistance so Russians could remove Ukrainian identity. In parallel, the process of forced deportation of Ukrainians and practice of filtration camps commenced. First days of April last year, after Russian forces left Bucha, Russian state-controlled news agency RIA News posted an article by Timofey Sergeytsev. I quote the name of the article, "What Russia should do with Ukraine," which provided, I quote again, "Denazification will inevitably also be a de-Ukrainization, a rejection of the large-scale artificial inflation of the ethnic component of self-identification of the population of the territories of historical Little Russia and New Russia. The name Ukraine apparently cannot be retained as the title of any fully denazified state entity. End of quote of Sergeytsev. Russian propaganda called for erasing the idea of Ukraineness. During the 33 days of occupation, Bucha has seen it all: torture chambers and mass graves, including women and children, shooting civilians and civilians in evacuating vehicles, conflict-related sexual violence, looting on massive scale, targeting of civilian objects. This small Bucha district witnessed 9,000 war crimes, including killing of 1,400 civilians and destruction up to 4,000 residential buildings. In Bucha, Russian forces went door to door claiming they were hunting Nazis. They were picking out those perceived to be leaders or with an active pro-Ukrainian position and mistreating and or executing them. Public officials and politically active citizens who dissented from denouncing Ukrainianness disappeared or were executed. We have accounts of Russian soldiers telling residents that they have orders to shoot or that they will exterminate everyone. Russians call it zachistka, meaning cleansing. A trend practiced by Russia during the Second War in Chechnya. Zachistka was raid-type operations characterized with human rights violations bordering to ethnic cleansing. We have seen the same type of operation in Bucha commanded by Alexander Chayko, formerly the commander of Eastern Military District, a person known for his brutality and savagery in Syria. Chayko has been indicted by us in absentia. We have observed identical pattern of crimes repeating itself in other liberated cities like Sumy, Chernihiv, Izum, Kherson. We fully comprehend that genocide is a distinct international crime requiring intentional destruction or extermination of members of protected group as such, stemming from 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. For individual accountability as envisaged in national legislation as well as in the Rome Statute, we should prove beyond the reasonable doubt that singular members of Russian armed forces and public officials have targeted Ukrainians due to their identity in pursuance of extermination policy, also known as genocidal intent. That intent to destroy means a special or specific intent, which in essence expresses the volitional element in its most intensive form and is purpose-based. Therefore, we have carefully examining available evidence in Bucha and elsewhere in two parallel dimensions, from genocide and from war crimes perspective. Whether the actions of singular persons that undoubtedly qualify as war crimes also bear the trait of the crime of genocide, as well as the existence of the pattern as an evidence of genocidal campaign. For this 1 year, we have progressed on war crimes investigation committed, for war crimes committed in Bucha, investigation and prosecution. We have identified 97 suspects. We have indicted 35 of them, and we have already convicted 2 war criminals in Ukrainian courts. Genocide as a crime is not reduced to the physical elimination of the group. It also encompasses damage to the group which may result from patterns of prohibited acts, including the forcible transfer of children from one group to another. Thus, the existing definition of the crime also allows us to examine forced deportation up to 20,000 Ukrainian children to Russia, along with their adoption process from the prism of genocide. The number, 20,000, is not the final figure. We fear it is much bigger and much higher in reality and will continue to increase on a daily basis. It is a well-planned strategy of separating children from their parents and families, even abducting them from Ukrainian boarding schools and hospitals, displacing them to Russia, and putting them through the adoption process. The same is true in relation to children who were orphaned as a result of the war. This process is accompanied by systematic process of so-called re-education and adoption process in Russia. It's part of planned policy from a chain of command orchestrated by Vladimir Putin and Kremlin leadership, logistically stretching from Black Sea coast to Siberia. We are particularly grateful to Prosecutor Khan of the International Criminal Court for taking up the issue of forced deportation of children as a priority case. It is not merely a case about war crimes or genocide. It's about our fight for the future of Ukrainian nation, since children are very essence, the best of our world to come. Undoubtedly, an arrest warrant to Putin is an historic decision. He is labeled as a war criminal, responsible for commission of the atrocious crimes in Ukraine. Let us be mindful of the fact that forced deportation of Ukrainian children is just one particular out of the vast collection of international crimes for which Putin should be held accountable. We name already the crime of aggression. And we believe that atrocities committed in Bucha also fall under his command responsibility. It is difficult to imagine that Putin was oblivious to the massive atrocities committed by Russian army. We believe there is a clear evidence that at least he has not taken any step either to stop or punish those who were under his command. Order number 215, dated 22nd of April 2022, granting the honorary name of Gvardeyskaya to the 64th Brigade of Ground Forces of Russian Federation for protection of homeland, I quote them, homeland and state interests in situation of an armed conflict, end of quote, is a testament to it. He awarded military unit which committed war crimes in Bucha after the world, all the world saw these atrocities by themselves. Therefore, I highly believe that the ICC arrest warrant marks only the beginning, and this is the first step. Beginning of significant process of the enforcement of justice and accountability on international level that so masterfully complements our efforts on national level. I would return to the beginning of my speech, to the word united. United, we can demonstrate that no one is or will be above the law. In the end, no matter who villain is, we believe that justice will always prevail. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the Prosecutor General. Let me now give the floor, please, to the EU Commissioner for Justice, Didier Reynders. Please, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dear Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm grateful for joining you today to deliver a number of closing remarks to today's event. Because as was said by the Secretary General, André, we continue to be united, and it's very important to continue to be united. For more than a year now, Russia's war of aggression has disregarded the foundations of our international rules-based order and brought death, devastation, and unspeakable suffering upon Ukraine. In this regard, we remember today the atrocities committed in Bucha. We do so knowing full well that commemorating these events will not bring back the many innocent people's lives that were lost. Neither will it fully heal the pain of their loved ones. Let me use this opportunity to express my sincere respect for all the brave survivors and witnesses of the atrocities committed in Bucha, some of which share their stories with us today. Your courage and perseverance are admirable. May the accounts we heard today serve us as a stark reminder that ensuring accountability for the crimes committed during this war is essential when working towards a future where lawlessness will be a feature of the past. As I said on several occasions, we need to ensure that the perpetrators of these crimes are held accountable. Last week in London, I met with Secretary General Costin, ICC Prosecutor Khan, EU member states, and several international partners to express our support to the ICC's investigations into the situation in Ukraine. We agreed that in the fight against impunity, we must work hand in hand and with full respect for the principle of complementarity. When it comes to preventing impunity for war crimes, including the deportation of 20,000 children, crimes against humanity, and genocide, the International Criminal Court remains the key actor to investigate and prosecute the perpetrators. At the conference in London, states therefore pledged an additional €4.1 million in support of the ICC. Let me also take the opportunity to briefly highlight the invaluable work of the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine, which has so far registered over 75,000 incidents of international crimes committed in Ukraine. It will be an immense undertaking to investigate and prosecute each and every of these crimes, and we must ensure that Ukraine prosecution services will be in a position to do so. In this respect, the Commission has already provided the Prosecutor General's Office with the necessary support and stands ready to provide further support moving forward. At the same time, I continue to encourage Member States to open national investigations on crimes committed in Ukraine on the basis of personal or universal jurisdiction. I welcome the fact that 14 Member States are already investigating international crimes. In March last year, Eurojust supported the setup of a joint investigation team in order to coordinate national investigations on international crimes between 6 Member States and Ukraine. For the first time ever, the Office of the Prosecutor ICC is participating in a JIT. This facilitates swift and efficient coordination with the joint investigation team members and will eventually benefit the investigations of both national authorities and the ICC. And I'm sure that we have different agencies at European level able to take part in the process to fight against impunity, and I'm sure that Europol is a part of the process that we have to put forward. In respect to the crime of aggression, the mother of all crimes, a crucial development has been the setup of the future International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine, ICPA, which will provide a structure for enhanced cooperation on the collection, preservation and analysis of evidence related to the crime of aggression for any future trial. Ultimately, we also need to look ahead to ensure that the ICC can effectively perform its function in the context of current conflicts as well as in the future. In order to pursue this objective, the Commission underlines the necessity to amend the Rome Statute in order to strengthen the ICC's jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. At the same time, we are exploring the establishment of an accountability mechanism, maybe a dedicated tribunal for the prosecution of the crime of aggression against Ukraine, which would respect the ICC's mandate and jurisdictional primacy. It is furthermore essential that Ukraine ratifies the Rome Statute. This will strengthen the international rules-based order for current and future generations of Ukrainians. Lastly, with regard to reparations, let me emphasize that making Russia pay for the damage it has caused remains a key priority of the European Commission. In this regard, I support the establishment of an international claims register to record evidence from citizens, legal persons, and the Ukrainian state of damages, loss, and injury as a result of Russia's war of aggression. Let me conclude by stating that while it is essential that we are ambitious in our response, all legal solutions must also respect EU and international law. I'm convinced that together, as an international community, we can find legally sound and effective solutions to bringing those responsible for these atrocities to justice. In striving for such a solution, let us never forget the horrors of Bucha that we commemorate today, and let we continue to be united for justice for all the Ukrainians that are suffering from such an aggression. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me now turn to Catherine de Boll, Executive Director of Europol. Before taking up her post as the Executive Director in May 2018, Ms. de Boll served as General Commissioner of the Belgian Federal Police from 2012. Prior to her appointment as the Commissioner, she was the Chief of Police in Nenov. In January 2015, she received the title of Public Manager of the Year. From November 2015 until November 2018, she was a member of the Executive Committee of Interpol. Mr. Boll, welcome. As we can hear, there's a variety of actors from the national courts to the International Criminal Court to the Joint Investigation Team. There's thousands of crimes. It all seems very confusing. How can Europol help? What must we do to move closer to concrete accountability?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dorda, for giving me the floor. I would like to greet everybody, the Excellencies. Certainly, I would like to pay tribute to the citizens of Bucha, the colleagues and the friends I have over there. Good afternoon. Mr. General Prosecutor, I am very grateful to you that you give us the opportunity to attend this event today. And I had the opportunity to have the feedback from your meeting from last week to Europol, because indeed the architecture is not always easy, but we always find solutions. And the victims are our first priority. That is why we can work together within the different frameworks. I would also like, on behalf of Europol and the whole of the law enforcement community in the European Union, to reiterate our solidarity with the European law enforcement colleagues and with the people of Ukraine, specifically with the citizens of Bucha, who are victims of this brutal act of aggression, assault launched by Russia. And this caused enormous suffering to the European people. So we are convinced that we can contribute to make those who are responsible for this suffering, to make sure that we can help to bring them before court, because the citizens of Bucha, they deserve justice. That is why Europol is putting the investigation, the support to the investigations of war crimes at the center of its support towards Ukraine. Since 2017, we have war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide in our legal framework. And since the beginning of the war, we received contributions from different member states on potential war crimes. And what we do at Europol is that we gather the information and that we merge data. For instance, data on relevant witness declarations, open source intelligence notifications, identifying committed war crimes. We also use digital material that is enriched with geolocation material. We merge all this data and then we try to identify the links between the different information that is at our disposal and to enrich, in fact, the information coming from countries. And that is the way how we support you, the General Prosecutor in Ukraine, the law enforcement community in Ukraine, and also the International Criminal Court investigations. We also did establish a task force on open source intelligence with the Ukrainian authorities, and already 13 countries confirmed to help you and us in these open source investigations. Concretely, until now, we analyzed at Europol 7,000 photos and pieces of video footage and more than 550 witness statements. And for the whole of Ukraine, we were able until now to identify 150 suspects related to war crimes. And together with the International Criminal Court, we also contribute to building Ukraine's witness protection capabilities. Putting an end to impunity is for us the most important, and this requires indeed that we are all united for justice at all levels. So I am already also very grateful to my colleague of Eurojust, Ladislav Hamran, because we did develop a good way forward how justice and police in the European level can work together to support our Ukrainian friends and to bring suspects before court. Our aim is to ensure interoperability, complementarity, and effective cooperation from operational perspective. And that is what we offer to you, to the Ukrainian General Prosecutor, to make sure that we are unified and aligned with you and to help the Ukrainian victims. To conclude, I would again like to reiterate to the General Prosecutor of Ukraine and to the people of Ukraine that Europol stands ready to support the international community's efforts to ensure full accountability for the crimes committed in Bucha and in all the other parts of Ukraine. Our action is guided by solidarity, by complementarity, and by unity of purpose. And I am convinced that by joining all the forces, we will be successful. And we are working on a daily basis for that. You really can count on us. We want to be part of the solution, and we want to be part of the people who bring those who did and committed these crimes before court. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the intervention. Let me now turn to Professor Payam Akvan, who serves as a senior fellow at Massey College, and he's the special advisor on genocide to the ICC prosecutor. Professor Akvan was the first legal advisor to the prosecutor's office at the ICTY, so many years ago now, and also has served with the UN in Bosnia, Cambodia, Guatemala, Rwanda, and Timor-Leste. He's worked on various cases, notable cases before pretty much all the international tribunals, the ICC, the ICJ, European Court of Human Rights, as well as various national jurisdictions. He really is, I can attest to this, one of the leading voices in our industry. Now, Professor, we've heard about full accountability. We've heard about the massive nature of these crimes. I want to ask about what should Ukraine focus on? Does it matter whether we're talking about war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, crime of aggression? These are legal categorizations. Do they matter?
Thank you very much, Wayne. I want to begin, first of all, by thanking our distinguished Prosecutor General, Andrei Kostin, and his excellent staff for their exceptional commitment and professionalism, and in view of the overwhelming scale of the crimes that have to be investigated. I also want to extend heartfelt condolences to all the families of the victims of these horrible crimes. And walking in this gallery today and seeing these images, I think was a very important reminder that behind every victim, there is a name, there is a mother and a father and a brother and a sister, a friend and a colleague. And I think that empathy is the beginning of this journey of uniting for justice. Because when we speak about these crimes as abstractions, we will never understand why we cannot allow impunity to stand. Having said that, I wish to begin with this category called crimes against humanity, which was first introduced in the Statute of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg in 1945. And returning to these horrific images that we view all around us and the testimony of the survivors who spoke about this horrific brutality, the Nuremberg Tribunal spoke about crimes which shock the conscience of humankind. And that is why we have this category called crimes against humanity. I want to begin with this because we should not assume that unless something qualifies as genocide or aggression or what have you, that somehow it is unimportant. We begin with war crimes, and then we escalate to crimes against humanity when there is a deliberate, widespread, or systematic attack against the civilian population. And it seems blindingly obvious that all the elements of those crimes are present in what we have witnessed in Bucha and throughout this war of aggression in Ukraine. So when it comes to the crime of genocide, something more is required. There is something beyond crimes against humanity, and the Prosecutor General, in his very astute comments, emphasized the centrality of the special intent requirement, which is the distinguishing feature of the crime of genocide. Now, maybe we go back to the Nuremberg judgment in 1946, where the term genocide was used in a descriptive sense, because there was no convention on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide until 1948. So the understanding then was that genocide was an intersection between the crime against humanity of extermination and persecutions on religious and racial grounds. But by 1948, the UN General Assembly had agreed on a definition of the crime, which applies to this day in the ICC statute and in the criminal code of most countries in the world. There were three categories which Raphael Lemkin from Lviv had introduced when he coined the term genocide. The first was physical genocide, the second was biological genocide, and the third was cultural genocide. The third category was rejected by the UN member states that were drafting the Genocide Convention. on the grounds that acts of cultural vandalism did not fit in the same convention that was dealing with the extermination of civilians in gas chambers. So whether we agree or not, we have a very narrow definition. The first three acts, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, and deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about destruction, are acts of physical genocide. And the following two acts, preventing births and forcible transfer of children, for the most part have been categorized as a biological genocide. So as is the case with any crime, one has to go where the evidence leads. And there is an investigation underway by the International Criminal Court, an investigation underway in the Office of the Prosecutor General, and one can certainly not discount the possibility that the elements of genocidal acts are present. It's necessary to do meticulous analysis before arriving at a firm conclusion. And the point here is that political leaders, scholars, human rights activists may use the term genocide in one context, but we are aware that in the field of criminal justice, the bottom line is there sufficient evidence to secure a conviction before a panel of judges, whether those judges are before the Ukrainian courts or the International Criminal Court? That is the technical question that every prosecutor asks, can I get a conviction? Because the last thing you want to do is to get an acquittal on such a charge which has such far-reaching significance on our historical conception and our moral conception of these crimes. I mention this because when I was at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, people forget that the first genocide case resulted in an acquittal. This was the case of Joran Jelisic, who described himself as the Serbian Adolf, who had confessed to killing 150 Bosnian Muslims and Croats in a detention camp in Brčko, but who was ultimately acquitted by a trial chamber on the count of genocide, despite our view that this was very, very clearly a crime which had all the hallmarks of genocide. So the first genocide conviction, of course, was before the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in 1998 in the Akayesu case. Rwanda involved the extermination of some 800,000 people in 3 months, which, of course, is not a requirement for a crime of genocide to have killings on such a scale, but it certainly helps in establishing the intention to destroy a group in whole or in substantial part, which is what the jurisprudence requires. Outside of the context of Rwanda, the only successful conviction before the ICTY was in respect of Srebrenica, which involved the mass execution of some 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys following the capture of the Srebrenica enclave in the summer of 1995. And the jurisprudence is quite significant when I think about the situation in Bucha and several other incidents in Ukraine, because the first case involved not Ratko Mladic or Radovan Karadzic, the people who were in the highest levels of leadership in so-called Republika Srpska, but it involved General Krstić, who was a significant but still lower-ranking military commander. And the jurisprudence of the appeals chamber of the ICTY in its 2014 judgment, I think, should be studied very closely because of two elements. The first is the definition of the term in part, because the intention does not have to be to destroy the global population of a group, but it has to be an intention to destroy at least a substantial part. And it's very difficult to define with any mathematical formula what we mean by that. You cannot have a numerical figure which is arbitrary, that everything above 500 killings becomes genocide, everything below does not, because it's the intention which matters. And unless you have a situation like Rwanda, where the perpetrators openly say on the radio that the Tutsis, which were the victim group, are cockroaches that must be exterminated. Very clear, direct public incitement to genocide. If you don't have that, then you have to infer it from the circumstances. And when those circumstances involve a large victim group, it becomes that much easier to infer. But the significance of Srebrenica is that the appeals chamber clarified that it is sufficient to determine that General Krstić had an intention to destroy a substantial part of the Bosnian Muslim group in Srebrenica and not globally. And one has to look at the authority of the perpetrator over a given territory or population to determine whether that intention is present. The second point goes to the relevance of what we call cultural genocide, which doesn't really exist as a crime, but it's more a descriptive term. What is the relevance of an intention to destroy the identity of a people? Well, it is absolutely relevant because it shows that the intended victim group are not the individuals who happen to belong to that group, but the group as such. There's an intention to bring about the destruction of that group as such. But ultimately, the intention must be the physical or biological destruction of the group. So if, let's say, the cultural symbols of a group are destroyed, that is relevant in inferring the intent, but something more is required in order to achieve a successful conviction. But I will end on one point, which I think is quite unique in the case of Ukraine, and that's the forcible transfer of children. And in my 30 years of seeing horrible things in the world, this is something that I hoped that I would not see. The last time we witnessed the large-scale forcible transfer or abduction of children was with Heinrich Himmler and the abduction of some 200,000 Polish children in the Second World War who were then intended to be Germanized. And I realized that we are not yet at a stage where we know exactly the full extent or the quality and circumstances of these abductions. But it's very clear that paragraph E in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention includes forcible transfer of children. So that provision is there for a reason. And it is not the forcible transfer as such, but when it is committed with the necessary intention. And I'm just going to end by noting that the forcible transfer of children was deleted from the definition of genocide because in the initial draft, it did not fall under physical or biological genocide. It was part of cultural genocide. It was reintroduced by a Greek amendment because Greece, in the context of the Civil War, had witnessed the forcible abduction of thousands of children by communist forces who had sent these children to Albania and Bulgaria and Romania and neighboring communist states. But the jurisprudence has interpreted that as a form of biological genocide. So it's not just the fact that children are taken away from their families to be forcibly assimilated and then to be returned to their communities, but it's the permanent removal of children from their group, from their community. So hopefully with these ongoing investigations, we will have greater clarity on the exact circumstances of forcible transfer. And if the evidence is present, this could very well be a case of genocide focused solely, if not in addition to other genocidal acts. I will also end with just one small observation, which goes back to why we're here, united for justice, why we cannot allow these crimes to go unpunished, irrespective of which label, war crimes, crimes against humanity, aggression, and what have you. And I want to recognize here in the presence of the honorable former president of Croatia that my career with the UN began in Ovčara, in Vukovar, where I first set eyes on a mass grave. And it's very difficult to understand the significance of a mass grave until you speak to those who've lost their loved ones, and then you begin to understand what it really means. And back in 1992, when I went to Vukovar for the first time, and I'm sure you will agree with me, it was unthinkable that Slobodan Milosevic would end up in The Hague. It was unthinkable that Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic would one day be arrested. But it came to pass. It came to pass because the international community was determined not to forget these crimes, not to sweep it under the carpet in the name of political expedience. And I'm sure that if we remain united for justice, we will also see the perpetrators of these crimes brought to justice. So thank you once again for your invitation, and thank you, Wayne, for chairing this session.
Thank you very much, Professor. So turning to Wade McCullen, who is an experienced American human rights lawyer of over 15 years' experience in support of human rights and social movements around the world. He now serves as an SVP of Programs and Legal Strategy at the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. As a human rights litigator, he has argued high-impact cases against state-sponsored repression and discrimination before the African and inter-American human rights bodies and led human rights investigations in over a dozen countries. Now, turning to you, Wade, we heard a moment ago from Payam about what seemed impossible previously with the likes of Milosevic and Mladic and Karadzic. It seemed impossible that there could be a tribunal for the crime of aggression at one point. The crime of all crimes, as they said at Nuremberg, the accumulation of the whole evil, which without Bucha would not obviously have happened. Where are we with those negotiations? Are we going to have a tribunal?
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Wayne. And first, let me just say thank you. As a representative from global civil society, it's really meaningful to be here today. Thank you to the people of Bucha, to the people of Ukraine. But to your question, Wayne, yes, it's a perfect segue to talk about this project, this initiative, this movement to create the special tribunal to prosecute the crime of aggression in Ukraine. The words of Dr. Akvan about how it seemingly felt impossible that Milosevic and others were going to be held to account. And in the throes of crisis, in the throes of war, in the throes of the mass atrocities happening, justice, accountability can often feel so far away and so impossible. But it is the job of civil society, of governments, of regional and international bodies to start doing the hard work right here and now to create the pathway for the possibility of that justice and accountability to come to fruition. And that brings us to the crime of aggression. As you mentioned in the Nuremberg judgment, they called the crime of aggression the supreme international crime. And we've come a long way in the terms of international justice, international criminal justice since Nuremberg. With the treaties, the conventions, the mechanisms, the courts, the bodies, the investigations, the technology, the immense and incredible work that is being done here in Ukraine and across the world on investigations and the use of technology and the collaboration and the cooperation to document and to bring perpetrators to account. We've come a long way, but we still have a gap, a crucial gap. And that crucial gap exists to address what Nuremberg judgment called the supreme international crime, the crime of aggression, the crime against peace. Einstein said that embedded in every crisis is a great opportunity. And we have that opportunity now. Over 140 states in the United Nations General Assembly have condemned Russia's act as an act of aggression in violation of the UN Charter. Condemnation, though, is not justice. Condemnation is not accountability. And that's the project that we have to devote ourselves to now, is to establishing a mechanism, a special tribunal that can hold the top leaders to account for initiating and executing this war of aggression. The evidence that Vladimir Putin and his senior officials initiated and executed this war of aggression exists in the public record. With investigation, I have no doubt that we will be able to unveil and uncover the evidence of the planning and preparation of the crime of aggression as well. But we still need a forum and a coalition of willing states across the globe to create an international tribunal that can be a space and a forum to hold the perpetrators accountable for the supreme international crime of aggression. I was just talking to a young Ukrainian man before this who lives just kilometers from Bucha. And he was saying that the people who are perpetrating this war of aggression, they are motivated and always thinking about the past, the past glory of the Soviet Union, the past glory of, to the Tsar era, and trying to recreate that past. But here in Ukraine, he was saying that he and his fellow Ukrainians are thinking about the future. And that's why it's a moral imperative for civil society, for governments, regional, international bodies across the globe to join the Ukrainian people in thinking about the future. Because the establishment of a special tribunal to prosecute the crime of aggression in Ukraine, yes, it's for the people of Bucha. Yes, it's for the people of Ukraine. But it's also for the future people across the world. We have, in the midst of this crisis, an immense, great opportunity to set a precedent, to actually hold leaders to account for violating and perpetrating the crime of aggression, the supreme international crime from which all other crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, has flowed. And we must not waste that opportunity. We must not waste it for the people of Bucha, for the people of Ukraine, but for all the peoples of the world. And so there's a long way to go. We have a coalition of the willing right now. We must ensure that it is a truly international tribunal that has the capacity to hold the top leaders to account. And that's what's necessary to get this done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's halt on that optimistic note. Thank you to all of our speakers, Mr. Kostin, Mr. Hamran, Mr. Reinders, Ms. De Bol, Professor Akvan, and Wade McCullen. Thank you very much.